Good evening and welcome to the first Café Scientifique of 2022. Café Scientifiques are the initiative of my office. We have started these almost a decade ago, and the purpose of the Café Scientifiques is to bring the expertise of the researchers at the university to the public in a comfortable environment. We used to do that at McNally Robinson Bookstore and felt it was quite a comfortable environment, but COVID had forced us. So we have to move. Once since we have moved online, we say that comfortable environment is in our homes, and that's where hopefully you are seated nicely in a comfortable sofa, couch, and with a coffee or tea in your hand. If you were in person, we certainly would have provided you with you coffee and tea and also some cookies, but we cannot do that being online. Today's Café Scientifique is entitled The Canadian Reconciliation Barometer, and your presence here certainly indicates that you see how important this is for you and for Canada, and you would today get to know more when the moderator introduces the panelists, and panelists would give you their perspectives. At the same time, please keep in mind it is an interactive session, and interactive sessions are only enhanced greatly by you asking questions. So please feel free to ask questions to the panelists, and panelists are ready to take those questions and give you. Certainly, they would give you. They try their best to give you the answer, but if they cannot find the answer, give you on the spot, they certainly would direct you to the right place, or they would certainly get back to you later. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's moderator, Iloradanon. Efimoff is a Haida and European settler from the northwest coast of British Columbia. After completing her BA Honours in Applied Psychology at Douglas College in New Westminster, British Columbia, Iloradanon worked as a research assistant with the Dudes Club, an Indigenous men's health organization in Vancouver. She later completed her MA in Applied Social Psychology at the University of Saskatchewan in 2018, focusing on perception and attitudes towards white presenting Indigenous peoples. She is currently a PhD candidate in social and personality psychology at the University of Manitoba under the supervision of Dr. Katherine Starzyk. Through her dissertation research, Iloradanon endeavors to create an accessible educational tool to help combat anti-Indigenous racism in Canada. With that, I welcome Iloradanon, your moderator, and then she would introduce the panelists and set some ground rules for this evening session. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Jayas, for the introduction. Tonight, our three panelists are going to be telling us more about the Canadian Reconciliation Barometer, a multidisciplinary project that aims to measure and track progress towards reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Before we introduce our panelists, I want to start by giving everyone a sense of what tonight will look like. After we introduce our panelists, we'll invite them to each briefly share some of their perspectives on the project and on reconciliation broadly. After this, we will take audience questions. Audience members can submit their questions to the panel using Slido. The link and password are in the YouTube description, as well as in the banner that you should see at the bottom of the screen here. Before we introduce our panelists, we also wanted to acknowledge that this project would not have been possible without all of the hard work from the rest of our team who are not here today. This includes collaborators Caitlin Neufeld, Lorena Fontaine, Mary Agnes Welch, Aaron White, and past collaborator Dean Peachy, as well as student research assistants Jaden Della Rosa, Kristen Smith, Tegan Ledoux, and previous research assistants Leora Strand, Jessica Trickey, Sandra Hunter, and Ashley Hayward. Finally, we would also like to gratefully acknowledge the support we have received from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation staff and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. We also gratefully acknowledge the lands that we are on today that have been stewarded by the Indigenous peoples who are in this area. One of our panelists today and the principal investigator on this project is Katherine Starzyk. Katherine Starzyk is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Manitoba and the director of the Social Justice Laboratory. She is also the founding member of the Center for Human Rights Research and a research affiliate at the Center for Social Science Research and Policy. Born in Poland, Katherine immigrated when she was 7 years old. She brings her identities as a Polish-Canadian woman to her research in the areas of social justice, intergroup relations, psychometrics, which is the scientific study of measurement, attitude change, and personality. Through this work, Katherine aims to help make social change through basic and applied research. She does this alongside talented students and collaborators. Another one of our panelists who will be speaking tonight is collaborator Moran. Rai is a proud member of the Red River Métis. Currently, Rai holds the office of Associate University Librarian, Reconciliation at the University of Victoria. Previously, Rai was the director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation from 2015 to 2020. Along the way, Rai contributed to major national initiatives, including the creation of the National Student Memorial Register, designation of multiple residential schools as National Historical Sites, and the development and launch of the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada. Prior to the NCTR, Rai served with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, where he facilitated the gathering of nearly 7,000 video and audio recorded statements of former residential school survivors and millions of pages of archival records. Another of our panelists this evening is collaborator Brenda Gunn. Brenda is the academic and research director at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation and a professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Manitoba. As a proud Métis woman, Brenda combines academic research with activism, pushing for greater recognition of Indigenous peoples' inherent rights as determined by their own legal traditions. Brenda worked at a community legal clinic in Guatemala on a case of genocide and continues to be actively involved in the international Indigenous peoples movement. She developed a handbook that is one of the main resources in Canada on understanding the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and has delivered workshops on the Declaration across Canada and internationally. We're very excited to have all our panelists here with us today, and we would like to open up the discussion by having Rai share some of his perspectives on the Canadian Reconciliation Barometer project.
Great. Thank you, Iloradanon, and thank you for this opportunity to open up this first part of the discussion. As you've heard, my name is Rai Moran, and I'm here today speaking to you from the traditional territories of right now the Wasanich peoples, where I'm sitting, but also work at the University of Victoria, which are in the traditional territories of the Lekwungen peoples. As was mentioned, I had the great fortune of spending about 11 years in Treaty 1 territories, homeland of the Métis, living in Winnipeg, working both with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation and with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself. Today, a bit of a complex day, actually, because our hearts and our minds are also with one of our team members who's just lost a family member right now. And if we can just all think about that team member and hold them in our hearts, it's a really tragic, actually, and heartbreaking loss. So their absence is very much being felt by all of our team today. Before I begin, I would like to thank the team that is present with us on this call today. There's been a lot of hard work on this project, and it's been a bit of an uphill battle actually to get us to this point. To at least share out some of what we've discovered along the way. Part of my opening remarks here are to provide a bit of context around why this Reconciliation Barometer exists and some of the thinking that went into the development of this. And, one of the places that we can start is all the way back at the beginning of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission really started to take its substantive steps in about 2009. Now, 2009 is getting to be a fairly long time ago. That's 12, 13 years ago. And to put that in context, when I first showed up at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and was tasked with some of the statement gathering work, I wanted to buy some iPads to facilitate the work, but iPads at that time weren't even available in Canada yet with cameras. So it seems like a different era. It's like the pre-tablet era of life, and iPhones themselves. It was just kind of the iPhone 3. One of the things that we were concerned with, and I think it's fair to say that it was a substantive concern, is what steps we would have to take as a commission, what type of social impact we would need to make in order to ensure that this particular shot at reconciliation would have the staying power. Center in our minds were, the experiences of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples and other really substantive efforts made by Indigenous peoples to bring about really a sense of reconciliation or a sense of justice in this country. And certainly when we look at the pickup of the recommendations made by the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, it was apparent that there was a huge, massive missed opportunity in the 1990s to have taken some serious and significant steps forward on this journey of reconciliation. That all really meant that there seemed to be a degree of, in a way, fragility around this entire process of effectuating or realizing a much more robust human rights framework in this country, a much more robust enjoyment of Indigenous rights in this country, because of the longstanding efforts that have been so hard fought for, and because of the uphill battle that had existed. Fortunately, time was a little bit different for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission versus, say, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and I think it was some of that early work that made some of our work that much easier. And I think we were met with a Canadian populace that was at least much more willing to hear, and certainly, without a doubt, the strength and the clarity and the heartfeltness of the survivor statements captured the Canadian public's attention in a very profound, very significant, and very sincere way. And Canadians began to pay attention. As we reached the end of the Commission's work, though, and as we began to start up the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation and began to look down the road, again, we were sort of met with this, this crossroads. Would Canadians actually truly pick up the calls to action? Would Canadians remain committed to this work of reconciliation in the short term, in the medium term, and certainly into the long term? Because, as what has been said by very eloquent speakers like Justice Murray Sinclair, this is intergenerational work. This work of reconciliation will take us years and decades to achieve. That meant that, in a sense, there is this fragility of the work of reconciliation. There's this continued need to both invest and reinvest in the work, and to remain diligent and on guard against slippage or regression or hardening social attitudes. So the Reconciliation Barometer is meant to be one of many, many tools, a complementary tool, if you will, to the calls to action, to the work of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, to the work, complementary to the work of a whole bunch of different folks across the country, to provide us more data points, more evidence of how we're doing as a nation and whether or not we are taking substantial steps in improving the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, whether or not the rights that are inherent of Indigenous peoples are actually being protected and promoted. So that led us to this really important set of conversations with, Dr. Starzyk and others on the team. Dr. Starzyk is going to talk a lot more about, the process and everything. But I wanted to share all of that because, really it's very, very important that we understand that the idea of a just, fair, equitable society, a just, fair, and equitable Canada, still has to be created. And it is a central part of this work of reconciliation that is the creation of a much more human rights focused and equitable society. So we've still got a long ways to go on this pathway. And I think what we will talk about today and what we're going to talk about in some of the findings is some of that work that still lay ahead of us. So I'll leave it there and I'll turn it over to my other esteemed colleagues. And I certainly look forward to the questions that you may have of us as we move forward.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Rai, for providing this important context for the project. Next, Katherine, could you please discuss the method of the project and briefly touch on the findings?
Sure. So first off, I just want to thank you, Iloradanon, for doing such a great job of moderating and organizing all of us. And Rai, thanks so much for your introductory comments. And I just want to acknowledge that I'm here on Treaty 1, and it's been my home for about 15 years. So those are the lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and of course the Métis Nation. And in our time here, we've had some opportunity to become more familiar with the groups here, but we still have, as a family, some more learning to do, and so I'm looking forward to that. So I always talk fast, so I'm going to try to slow down. So we have a number of goals. The one that we've been focusing the most on is trying to understand what reconciliation means to Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. And when I say we, there's a bigger team, as Iloradanon said. And one of the groups that I also want to highlight is Probe Research, who has really increased our capacity in polling and understanding how to translate our results to the public. But it has been a long road. So there have been many steps from 2015 in collaboration with Rai, with Dean Peachy, with several other people that Iloradanon mentioned. We've been thinking about what reconciliation means to Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. And it's been really important for us that we create a measure that reflects what we hear from various people who we really needed to listen to, rather than just coming up with an idea ourselves. So we went out and we listened to what reconciliation leaders across the country said reconciliation means to them, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. We didn't go everywhere we wanted to. We tried to go everywhere and it just wasn't possible. So hopefully we can do more of that in the future. We also were very fortunate enough to access the Nctr Archives. With the support of NCTR, we are able to read what reconciliation means to survivors and to think about that in deciding what we should track. Then through the lab and hard work of all the students, we are able to go out across the world and ask people, how are you tracking reconciliation? And learn from them so that we could take away what we thought might work here. So we went through a process after all of this listening, and that listening certainly isn't done. That's something that we see going forward. We sat down and we very carefully thought about the questions that we should ask. So we have an approach that's centered in something called psychometrics. And you don't really need to know much about that, but what you should know, what you should know is that we really care that the questions get at what we say that they get at, that they're trustworthy questions, that, have fairly little error in them. And so that process took several months of curation. And now we have 13 indicators of reconciliation. We're going to add to these indicators over time. They're not a fully written thing. It's going to be something that evolves as we track reconciliation. We'll realize that we need to add some things. And so this is a very evolving project. But the takeaway is that we have polled for the first time. We have a large sample of people that we've asked these questions of, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people across 5 regions in Canada. And we've drafted a report that we hope will be out to you sooner than later. And it reflects this very careful attention to detail and to honoring the great generosity that our participants in our, focus groups and interviews, gave us in their time, and also the NCTR in sharing those transcripts with us, which was very, very valuable. I'm not sure if that gives all the detail that you want, but Iloradanon, if I'm missing something, please let me know.
No, perfect. Thank you so much, Katherine. Brenda, could you now please tell us a little bit about the policy implications of this work?
Thank you, and thanks so much for having me today. I'm hoping my internet issues have magically resolved. There's not fantastic tech support in my house. My 3-year-old can use the internet but not yet fix it. So I'm really excited to be here today on Treaty 1 territory, the homeland of the Métis, and my traditional territory where I was born and raised and continue to live with my family. I'm also really excited to be part of this project. I'm one of the newer additions to the team, and so I'm really excited to be learning about the science of psychometrics. Katherine has been doing lots of schooling, and I'm learning how to read numbers, and it's a really fantastic project. And the more I dive into it, the more I can really see how we can use the information coming out of the barometer and out of the polls to really push for substantive changes in Canada. And so I'm going to just talk for maybe a minute or two about some of the policy implications generally, but I'm happy to talk maybe about some more specific recommendations if people are interested. So I think, people joining in today are probably going to accept the fact when I say reconciliation is complicated. Right? I think we can sort of, most conversations on reconciliation, or when you teach it in the classroom, you start with, well, what is reconciliation? I think there's great value in this project in that it provides a perspective on reconciliation and a definition and a place to work from. And that's valuable. I mean, there's lots of definitions out there, but part of what we have here is a definition and an approach or indicators of reconciliation that are grounded in the years of research, drawing on the resources that are existing. And I'll talk a bit about how I think that can be used more broadly in a minute. But I think the other starting point that we want to think about is recognizing that residential schools were just one aspect of broader colonial project that really was grounded in law and policy for the assimilation of Indigenous peoples, right? So if we accept that reconciliation is complicated and that residential schools was part of a coordinated approach to assimilating Indigenous peoples that was grounded in law and policy, I hope that it becomes clear that what we need to do in part of achieving reconciliation moving forward is to really start addressing the harms of residential schools, which means changing the laws and policies that supported residential schools and its legacy as it exists today, because we know the impacts are ongoing. And so as we move forward, I think one of the real values of the barometer then is to start to think about, where do we put our time and energy in our advocacy? What are the areas that we need to focus on? Where is Canada doing well? What can we celebrate? Where are we leading the world in reconciliation? But what else are the areas that are perhaps needing more attention? And there's different ways we can get to that, but I think the barometer is a really important tool in this process, because it gives us that sense of where people are in Canada, across Canada, based on all sorts of different criteria and characteristics of the Canadian population. I also think the barometer becomes really important because policymakers like data. And I am a social scientist, and I tend to do mostly qualitative research, and I think there's a lot of value in qualitative research. But we also want to accept the fact that policymakers want to see some numbers. And so the barometer gives us that. It gives us a hard sense of where people are at. And once we have those numbers, it becomes harder for policymakers to ignore.
Mm-hmm.
I think also, because reconciliation is such a long-term project, as Katherine has already alluded to, measuring reconciliation over time will help keep reconciliation on the policy and political agenda as we move forward. People get fatigued of issues, and there's many priorities we have in Canada. And so through the barometer and measuring the progress of reconciliation in Canada, we can help keep reconciliation on the agenda. It also, I think, is really useful, the barometer is really useful in addressing concerns that may come from the public or politicians when they try to say, well, what more do you want? We've already spent X number of dollars, right? And everyone, politicians are always happy to sort of parade out numbers of how much money they've spent on an issue. And what the barometer gives us is an indication of, yes, this money is working, we're making progress, but we're not there yet. And so I think it's really important and is a useful tool in the advocacy to say we need to keep doing more. And then by looking at the different indicators and progress over time, we can start to say where we need to focus our energies.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for sharing those exciting policy implications, Brenda. And thank you to all of our panelists for such a perceptive opening to our discussion this evening. So we can now move into the question and answer part of this evening. As a reminder to the audience, you can submit your questions to the panel using Slido. The link and the password are in the YouTube description, as well as in the banner that you can see at the bottom of the screen. So we do have a couple questions submitted anonymously to from the audience. I'm just going to pull them up here. So the first one is for Rai, and the person asks, you mentioned how reconciliation is an intergenerational project. How do we keep the public motivated? So I think Brenda kind of touched on that a bit in what she shared, but could you share your thoughts on that, Rai?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that's one of the big questions, right? That is the question, that's the opportunity, that's the fear, that's the concern, right? So we're kind of operating on a spectrum on this question around how do we keep the public motivated. What I've kind of seen just in my own personal journey through this is that there's been these sort of like waves of leadership, waves of events, waves of things that have captured our attention over the last number of years. And what I'm hopeful for is that those waves will continue moving into the future. And each time we have one of these waves, I don't know, maybe if I even use the metaphor, the imperfect metaphor of, a rising tide on a beach, we're learning a little bit more. We're deepening our understanding so that when the wave comes back out, we're still like kind of progressing in a way. So for example, what is an example of that? I have thought a lot about how the public reacted to the discovery of the children at the Tecumloops to Secwepemc gravesite this summer. And I've reflected on that a lot because on the one hand, I mean, these were stories that had been told in the media, by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, certainly by survivors for decades, literally. I mean, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued an entire report on it. We had already been on the front page of the paper multiple times. We had the National Student Memorial Register. But I think part of what allowed Kamloops to be so powerful was the combination of all the other steps, all the other initiatives that were sort of mutually reinforcing and strengthening to allow people to understand what all of it meant once that discovery actually happened. So it was a combination of Phyllis Webstat's work with Orange Shirt Day. It was a combination of the TRC. It was the combination of the hard work that teachers are doing inside of the K-12 system. It's the work that's happening training public servants in accordance with, Call to Action 57. It's adopting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's the protests up in Wet'suwet'en territories. It's this whole myriad of activity. It's even people like Gord Downey in the mix there doing his work on the Secret Path, that are helping keep this in the public's attention. And I think the key to all of this is that we just have to keep talking about this. We just cannot stop talking about this, and we have to keep asking ourselves the question. And certainly for leaders, for leaders of organizations, for community groups, for religious leaders, for everyday citizens, it's important that we make these things like standing agenda items that come up regularly. And you can even look, for example, at the fact that, say the University of Manitoba, University of Victoria, where I'm at, we now have entire, vice president structures that are dedicated to protecting and affirming the rights of Indigenous peoples really within these institutions. That's helping keep all of this alive. The barometer is but one tool. One thing that I think the TRC was quite clear on, though, in the calls to action, though, is this continuous nature of it. So if you look at the calls to action, what is oftentimes repeated is annual celebrations, annual days of remembrance. So the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, a day for us to come together. Reports on data. We're supposed to have an annual report on reconciliation through the National Council. Annual stats on the number of children in care, annual stats on over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples or rates of incarceration, annual stats on justice. So this annualizing, regularizing the conversation, the coming together of this information is really at the heart of just keeping the fire lit, really.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Thank you, Rai. So we're seeing the need for a collective, multifaceted approach that's looking at systems, that's making us, keep track of things, keeping things annual, keeping things regular to keep it top of mind. Brenda, did you have something you wanted to add?
I was just, as Rai was talking, I was sort of thinking a little bit more about the barometer on this. And I think the question sort of speaks to the importance of the barometer itself, right? Because I think people get fatigued and get frustrated and drop in, right? And this is why in climate change advocacy, sometimes people really advocate for the small activities you can do at home to reduce your carbon footprint, because if people don't feel that they can contribute, the problem seems too big. And so I think the barometer is really useful in that it really brings reconciliation to the individual level, and then measures progress, right? Because when you're not there yet, when that end goal is years, decades, I'd hate to say generations out, it can be hard to keep people motivated. And so I think part of the idea of the barometer is also then to people, no, look, we're taking steps, and you may not be able to see them in everyday ways because maybe those stats aren't changing yet, but maybe we can start to see some of those small steps, and that can sort of motivate people to take another step, to stay on the project of reconciliation and keep doing the hard work.
Thank you so much for sharing, Brenda. Yeah, that these types of projects help people feel like they can contribute, see kind of what might be hidden actions that are happening on a daily basis, and keep people motivated on the topic. So we do have another question from the audience. This is from Amy Smith, and they say, did you connect with Reconciliation Australia on their biannual barometer they use? I'm a Métis woman from Alberta, but live in Australia now and work with this organization. So Katherine, you're probably best suited to respond to that question. So go ahead.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you so much, Amy. We did, and actually, in part through Rai, when he was the director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, we were able to connect with Reconciliation Australia, as well as the counterpart in South Africa. And so early on, we did consult with them about their experience in the barometer, and actually have very recently also touched base about thinking about discussing how we can kind of build a better foundation for our project so that we can continue to do this for a long time. So we know that Reconciliation Australia has, I believe recently celebrated their 20th anniversary, and so has the South African group. And so, there are things, valuable lessons that they've learned in that process. And so we're not looking to, start from scratch. We want to learn from the things that other people, have done in this process. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that question.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, lots of places around the world where this work is relevant. So we do have another question here from Anonymous. And this is a question, I think, to the entire panel. So maybe we can, maybe we'll start with Brenda, then we'll have Rai share, and then Katherine. So this person says, listening was important to this valuable project. Realizing data reports are premature, do you have anecdotal information on how people currently track reconciliation? Brenda, do you want to start us off? You can always pass if you don't want to. No, okay. Rai, do you have any thoughts?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, I mean, I guess the question relates to what did we find in the barometer? Is that kind of better what I'm understanding? Or?
I think kind of how people are currently tracking it anecdotally.
Oh, yeah. Well, that question of how people are tracking it anecdotally, I can certainly provide a number of resources and thoughts on that. So there are some really important efforts being made in the country to track implementation of the TRC's calls to action. So Ian Mosby, one researcher, has been working on that, has been doing kind of just a personal project to track implementation. CBC has done quite an expansive set of work on their project called Beyond 94, again, tracking implementation of the TRC's calls to action. Douglas Sinclair is actually working on a really nice initiative called Indigenous Watchdog. And that, again, looks quite carefully at the implementation of the calls to action and provides extra information on that. Now, one of the things with all of those efforts is also hindered by the lack of progress that we've seen on the TRC's calls to action, and specifically the calls to action asking for the creation of a National Council on Reconciliation. And what all of those efforts are suffering from to a certain degree is the production of data from provincial and federal and actually municipal bodies to really then give weight to the annual report on reconciliation and give further weight to the key indicators that are outlined in that National Council's report. More broadly, certainly in my role when I was the director of the NCTR, I would say probably one of the most frequently asked questions that I had was, how are we doing? You know, how are we doing on reconciliation? Are we doing it? Are we not? And it is kind of an imperfect answer oftentimes that I could give. And you know, but that said, there are some real tangible things that we should lean on and celebrate as a country. And so I talked about early TRC and there were no iPads. Well, more concerningly and frankly more devastatingly to our overall human rights sort of framework in this country, residential schools were also not in school curricula at the K-12 level when we started out at the TRC. I mean, that seems unfathomable, you know, now that we weren't talking about this glaring, horrific aspect of our country's history that had existed since really the dawn of Canada into the late 1990s, as recent as 2010. So there are really important indicators that we can look at, and now really every jurisdiction in the country does have information on residential schools within them. The question is you know, how are we going to see that knowledge that students are now exiting schools with really begin to impact our future society? You know, there's other tangible things too. Like we are right now standing on the precipice of the first graduating cohort that will graduate with a joint degree in Indigenous law and common law in the world. I mean, that's pretty amazing. That's, you know, graduates out of the University of Victoria's Indigenous Law program. That's pretty amazing in the sense that they're going to be exiting, going into the workforce, bringing in these concepts of Indigenous law into the regular function and course of activities as lawyers. And that's the first cohort. So, you know, lots of tangible things like that. And all we have to do really is look at the firsts that we're still encountering. Bridget Larocque being the first NHL scout for a hockey team, first Indigenous female hockey scout. So, you know, lots of firsts that are still happening. And those are all signs, I think, of some positive things that are happening. And I'll keep it positive rather than looking at the negative, because there's still lots of negative happening too, you know, so, yeah.
Yeah, so it sounds like we're seeing lots of progress, lots of good things happening, things that we should celebrate, but not to forget the distance that we still need to travel and the immense amount of work that still needs to go into reconciliation. Katherine, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that Rai said was great. What I would say is that my experience with reconciliation is there are a couple different things three different things that are happening that I see around me. One is that often like people take what's happening in their own lives as an indication of what's happening. But sometimes like we surround ourselves with like-minded people. And so it's difficult to kind of understand how much what is happening to you and your friends and your family is happening out there. And so sometimes, you know, you can get a better sense of that by speaking to other people. And I see that too. Like I've been to a lot of sharing circles or just informal discussions about reconciliation and you know, people have perspectives on how things are going. And those are all valid. I mean, that's what's happening for those people in those communities, in their lives. Those matter. And they might be different than the data across the country. Because there are these different pockets, right, where things are a little bit different. But what we want to kind of give people a sense of is, on average, how are things happening? How are things going? With, you know, some discussion of how things vary across regions. The other thing I would say is I do want to acknowledge that other people are also releasing relevant data. And so we're not the only people that are tracking this. And so there are other reports available. And to the extent that people read these reports, then that's another sense of another way to get a sense of how things are going.
Well, just if I may, I'll just tell one super little quick story too, that I was laughing with a friend of mine with the other day is, we did do a little bit of sampling just early on during my time at the NCTR as well. And one of the stats that came out at that time was that it was actually younger people in Canadian society. I think that the 29 age group hadn't really heard that much about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I was out at a restaurant with a colleague of mine who's very invested in reconciliation, lives, breathes, eats, sleeps this work. And I was telling them about this, and they said, no way, that's not true. And I said, watch this. And we walked up to just this kind of random group of younger people on the street. And I said, hey, just out of curiosity, have you heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission at all? And they said, the what? And my friend was actually quite flabbergasted, because exactly as what you said, Katherine, we can get into these sort of echo chambers sometimes. And just because it's important for some of us doesn't mean it's necessarily important for others. So one of the efforts with this barometer, I think, is to assess how much Canadians are paying attention to a number of really key indicators that are really important for long-term success in regards to human rights and human dignity and equality in this country.
Yeah, thank you so much for these points on, the circles that we're already in and how to expand those circles to get a better kind of sense of other people's experiences, and highlighting how reconciliation is a shared experience for everybody who's in Canada. We're all just at kind of different levels of it. So we do have another question. We've got a few questions. I'm trying to go in the order that they came in. So we do just have a thank you. I assume that's what it's saying. I can't say the word, but it's to Rai for noting that reconciliation must be intergenerational. Prior settlement was confined to survivors, many who journeyed on, but their errors carry the trauma. So that thank you for acknowledging the intergenerational nature of reconciliation. So thanks for that, Rai. We can also move on to a question from Lola, who is on Stolo territory. And Lola says, please tell us what the 13 indicators are.
Great. Katherine, are you taking that one?
Okay, sure. I wasn't sure who wanted to take that one. I'm happy. So, you know what? It's going to take me a little bit, like there are 13, but I can summarize them somewhat. So some of it is about having a good understanding of things. So that having a good understanding of the past and the present, and that includes past government harm, residential school harm, an understanding of how that past is connected to now. So the ongoing harm, that thread that connects the past and the present, how much we're engaged and support Indigenous communities and causes. Of course, a lot of people have emphasized mutually respectful relationships, but also relationships at the national level. So nation to nation relationships. Personal equality is key, as is systemic equality. And that requires representation and leadership of Indigenous peoples in all sectors of society. With reconciliation, we also believe that Indigenous peoples should be thriving in many ways, but also that the natural world should be respected, so that reconciliation involves not just having respectful relationships with each other and flourishing, but also the flourishing of the natural world. And very importantly as well, apologies for what has happened, that are, that acknowledge that harm, that are truly remorseful and are sincere.
Great, thank you, Katherine. Yeah, it's a big concept with lots of different kind of facets, lots of things to remember. Rai or Brenda, did you want to add anything to that before we jump on to the next audience question?
Yeah, I just might reiterate a couple points there that Catherine's made, is that, it is the relationship between, the past, present, and future, right? So how we understand our shared experiences of the past, how we understand what's happening today, and really it's both the interpersonal and the systemic, and that's, I think, what Katherine has said, that the systemic barriers to equality are really, really important. And there's a lot of Canadians that still aren't, are still struggling to understand some of those systemic barriers. So, keeping an eye on some of these indicators really gives us a sense of how, especially mainstream Canada, is understanding the world around it. And I think one of the things that has emerged so far from what we've seen is that Indigenous peoples are living in a different world, than mainstream Canada. Mainstream Canada exists in a really fundamental different sort of, what it sees and what it, more importantly, doesn't see is different. And at some point, and we've heard folks like, again, Murray Sinclair say this very clearly, is that we need to find ways to create these new national narratives. We need to be able to tell our stories in a way that doesn't diminish or doesn't continue really to silence Indigenous histories and Indigenous realities in this country. And that's a big step for a lot of Canadians. It's a big step to become aware of that.
Thank you, Rai, for that beautiful summary there of, this relationship between past, present, and future. I love that. And how Indigenous people are living in a different Canada than other Canadians. I think that's a really important thing for people to remember. So we'll move on to our next. Yeah, Brenda, please jump in.
I only wanted to jump in after Rai was talking because, as I said, I'm really new to the team and have no quantitative research background, so my learning curve is steep, to say the least. There's a really bad joke to make with the COVID test positivity rate in Manitoba, I think, right now, but maybe we won't go there. But I think one of the things that I've am learning, and it's kind of embarrassing, all these things I need to learn, and my process of measuring, right, is to ask these questions, and we have these indicators of reconciliation, but then it's like, how do you take them to understand what reconciliation is, or how to start measuring it? And so I think, based on what Rai was saying, one of the indicators that we even have, or how we measure reconciliation, or how Katherine and the quantitative researchers on her team, like Iloradanon, is by looking at the similarity of responses between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. And I think that was implicit with what Rai was saying, but I think, when people get the report in their hand and looking at it, that's one of the things to really look at, right? When you look at the responses from Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples, it's not even necessarily that we need to be doing really well on things, but an indicator of reconciliation could actually be that we both are seeing the same reality, right? And so I wanted to really pull that out from what Rai was saying, and I'm not trying to, I don't know, do you females blame? But in the approach, and now I'm really embarrassed because I can't remember the second way that we're measuring reconciliation, and I just reviewed the report today.
No worries. So let me go in here. And what I will say, Brenda, is that it's incredible to have you as part of the team, and you should not be so modest, because my understanding of qualitative methods, as Iloradanon will tell you, is pretty sparse. And so we have learning to do from each other, and that's kind of like the beauty of our team. We have like such diverse skills, and those skills are respected, and then they combine together to make something better than any one of us could do. So you bring this like great perspective on like, this is unclear, and then we can write it so it's clearer to people like that aren't like, as some would call us, like number geeks. We know who you are anyway. But the other way, so we've got agreement between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. It's very important that we see the same thing. you know, that we agree that if Indigenous people suggest that, you know, there's real personal inequality, non-Indigenous people should see that as well. And if they don't, then that's concerning.
Yeah.
But the other one is just we don't want just people to agree that there's real personal inequality. we want that to kind of, we want people to say, well, no, actually, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada, you know, have the same equal life outcomes, and both groups can say that. So we're not just hoping for agreement; we're hoping for agreement that things are good.
Yeah. So those are, you know, two key things you'll want to keep an eye out for when you're looking at these findings. So, you know, how much of a difference is there between Indigenous and non-Indigenous respondents? And, you know, are we seeing the outcomes that we would hope to be seeing? So I'm going to move on to another participant's question. So this question is coming from Karina. This person says, thank you all. What have been some of the most interesting findings of your project so far? So we've covered that a little bit, I think, already, just in that last one. But if everyone wants to speak just briefly on, you know, maybe one thing that really stood out to you as being really interesting, that would be super great to hear.
I can just say one thing here, and it's not actually a finding of the report, but it's a method of the report that I think is really important, and I really want to acknowledge actually Elder Harry Bone for just helping remind us of this. So before we even got to the measurement part or to the findings part, you know, Elder Bone really reminded us to keep things positive. And one of the things that is in this report is that we stated human rights affirming statements that reiterated or echoed aspirations, hopes, dreams, realities, rights of Indigenous peoples. And we allowed people to agree or disagree with those positive statements rather than agreeing with negative statements, right? Because unfortunately, we live in a society that is still profoundly racist and still, you know, many people harbor quite harmful and damaging views of Indigenous peoples in their minds. And we did not want to give any space to that negative thinking in the exercise of our asking these questions. So, you know, is that a finding of the report? No, but is it a really important reminder? And is it an important sort of methodological call to action that we can adopt each and every day to keep things positive? I think it really is. And for me, at least personally, it was just a real important, not only a reminder, but just a lesson on just good relations and staying positive, you know, staying positive, because this is hard uphill work. So, you know, yeah, that's my statement on that, at least. So, yeah.
Thank you, Rai. Yeah, the importance of allowing people to agree with good things instead of disagree with good things, right? That definitely is an important piece. Maybe Katherine, did you want to speak to what you think one of the most interesting findings was from the report? Just one. I know there's so many, but
okay. Well. Okay. So for me, I don't think that this is the most important finding from the report, but it is an interesting one that made me a little bit sad. And it is, so one of the areas that we're doing the best is our understanding of residential school harm. Compared to other things, that's where, especially Indigenous people, you know, have a good understanding of things, but also non-Indigenous people reported that they have a good understanding of that. However, there is this, of the indicators, that's where our largest gap is as well. And so I had thought, you know, with my kids going to grade school and learning all these things in grade school and having, you know, real celebrations and integration of Indigenous, you know, ways of thinking and being within the school, I thought that we would be closer together on that. And that is where our biggest difference is. So there's clearly more need for education. And again, I think this is one of those experiences of having a blind spot. When you're thinking about things a lot, and your school in particular, your kid's school in particular, is doing a good job in this respect, you come to assume that that's happening elsewhere.
Yeah, you kind of end up assuming.
There's lots.
Sorry, Katherine. Sorry, your internet got a little fuzzy there, so I thought I'd jump in. Nope, all good. Yeah, so it is interesting again how reconciliation is this shared reality that's again so different for people, and the way it is for you is not necessarily the way it is for other people. Brenda, did you have any thoughts on kind of the single most interesting finding, if you could pick one?
Yeah, I feel like I'm cheating because I'm getting my notes from the meeting with Katherine where she walked us through everything. Because again, I needed a lesson on all of this. And, I think one of the things that Katherine pointed out when sort of walking us through the numbers was just, I think, along with what she was saying, just even the ongoing size of the gaps. Like, we knew there would be gaps. And I think going through the indicators, it was still showing a lot of work to do just on still how far apart we are. And so that there's still a lot of work to do. And so I think that's one of the things that really stood out for me. And then I think the other thing that is really interesting, and I don't think I can speak to the details enough, but is just areas where we have a lot of consistency across Canada. And for better or worse, that's also really important. And then, because we also are able, or we, Katherine and her team, in doing this first poll, because I wasn't involved yet, I feel like I shouldn't include myself perhaps in that way, but being able to also see the regional differences. And I think that's really important, and to think about what that means, right? So I am a prairie girl, born and raised. I've lived in Toronto, I've lived in Guatemala, I've lived in, a few places, but really I'm a prairie girl at heart. And so, really hard for me to hear that the prairies are really bad and that we're not doing well here. And I know that, right? And I see the racism, my family experiences the racism. We know that. But that's hard to sort of hear. And so really thinking about, well, what do we need to do? Or why is it that we're in this place here on the prairies? And is it just more visible and palpable? And, it leads to all sorts of other conversations. And I think that's, one of the values of the barometer is to really spark those conversations, to start understanding why and what do we need to do.
Yeah, those regional differences are super interesting, and kind of again looking at that distance apart, not only between different groups, but also just within regions of the country. So that it definitely sparks lots of discussion, lots of further questions that we'll hopefully be able to tackle in future iterations. Brian, did you want to add something?
Just maybe one small thing too, because it's just I have the report in front of me, and one thing that did jump out too is measures of intent as well, and I think that is kind of interesting. One that I had circled was whether or not Indigenous peoples were actually harmed on purpose, right? And Canadians they agree that there was harm inflicted, but have a harder time understanding that there was intention behind some of the actions undertaken by the Canadian state. And that one resonates for me in particular right now, because I actually I was reading some remarks made by a very well-known Canadian historian that was kind of pushing back around assertions of genocide in this country. And this historian was saying, well, look, I mean, basically you can't equate to removing absolutely every single aspect of somebody's indigeneity with genocide. Like this, and sitting underneath this was this idea that really somehow you could be Indigenous without culture, language, identity, history, or future. So you could be like a shell, and that was okay in a way. Like, yes, so what they were struggling with in my mind was taking the leap to understand that there has been intent, and that there has been actually some very significant intent behind these longstanding government policies. And I think that's kind of bursting the bubble for a lot of Canadians, because Canadians have liked to believe that we are a bastion of human rights. They've enjoyed believing that we are this kind of safe harbor for many nations around the world. But it's turning that lens inside and beginning to become much more cognizant of our histories and understanding the long-term intent and actions and systemic nature of this harm, and really, frankly, the deliberate nature of this harm too, the precise intent that was chosen to, for example, separate children between their parents, from their parents. That was very, very, very intentional to accelerate the process of a forced assimilation, and to accelerate the intentional destruction of Indigenous cultures. So Canadians, I think, still have to take a big step, a big, hard, uncomfortable step in becoming much more aware of the intent behind these actions.
Yeah, and maybe that's reflecting the need for some of these updates to happen in curriculum, for that history to be filled in so that these discussions happen in classrooms. So we're having that in-depth discussion that's going to move that thinking. So I'm going to move on to another audience member's questions. I know the audience likes to hear their questions asked and answered. So this question is from Cheryl Chartrand. So they ask, is the reconciliation study incorporating an elders panel for guidance that can ensure traditional and cultural knowledge is part of the work? And whoever wants to take a go at that, maybe, Katherine or Rai, I think they've been a bit more involved in that process.
Yeah, I can comment a bit on that, in that, I mean, our ongoing work is, continues to be quite inclusive. Many groups have been engaged with along the way, and certainly even in my time at the Nctr, there we were always continuously engaged with elders, knowledge keepers, and directly tied to the ongoing survivors circle of the Nctr as well. So certainly those groundings, those teachings I've already referenced, even just the instructions of Harry Bone that were really fundamental in setting out the foundation, I think are vital. And that is something that's so important in this work. And I think Katherine mentioned it as well. And just to reiterate a bit of a point there, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself, in its statement gathering process, really only did ask 3 sort of regular routine questions of people. And you can get a sense of some of the priorities of the commission by virtue of these questions. One was, are you aware of a child that went missing or died in the school? Right? Because this question of missing children was so important. 2, what does Canada need to do to heal through all of this? And 3, what does reconciliation mean to you? Right? So that question was offered, or was brought into the statement gathering sessions that were held by the TRC, and that was the work that was very carefully analyzed by Katherine, and you, Iloradanon, you took a hard look at a lot of those, and really sat with those very sincere offerings given by survivors, and took those words very much to heart, and I think that was a really important foundational part to this, because ultimately it was survivors that gave us the opportunity to have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the first place, and pushed so hard for this intergenerational work of healing. So I think it was very important that those really thoughtful words be brought in right at that point. So,
So there's that grounding within survivor experiences, and then this continual kind of informal guidance with different folks who can, help us do this work in a good way. Thanks, Rai. Katherine, did you want to add anything?
I just also wanted to acknowledge, the elders, knowledge keepers that we spoke to when we went to do the focus groups and interviews. So they graciously agreed to help us host things in a good way, and also to provide their perspectives on things. And that was very, very valuable for us. So I just want to acknowledge those people and yeah, their important contributions.
Great, thank you, Katherine. I'm going to jump ahead in the questions a little bit here. Here's a question from another anonymous submission. This is for Brenda. You mentioned changing laws and policies. Could you provide an example?
Oh. I think I feel like we're early on in the process, but one of the things that maybe is an example is to think about the education laws in each of the provinces and how curriculum is developed, right? And so, one of the things that I could see potentially coming out from this work is thinking about how do we ensure that we entrench commitment to educating people on residential schools in curriculum, not based on current political climate, but in ways that sort of sustain this process. So thinking about provincial education laws that don't tend to be really prescriptive in what needs to be covered, but is there a reason that we might need to be more prescriptive in this area, given the harm that we need to overcome and the generations of educating that need to happen, particularly as we get further out from residential schools and more people start to think about residential schools as something in the distant past, so that it doesn't slide off. So I think there's ways there. There's also a range of policies just that even relate to funding priorities and how governments, federal, provincial, and territorial, allocate budgets, right? And so to think about what are the principles that are guiding us to make sure that we're spending money that is going to have an effect and promote reconciliation.
Lovely. Thank you, Brenda. So yeah, this idea that we really need to form policy that's going to entrench and create sustainable sources of education on Indian residential schools, in schools across the country, regardless of kind of political standing in the country. And that might be related to funding priorities. So I'm going to jump right into another question that I think I'm actually going to answer if the panel is okay with that. So this question is from Trina. And Trina asks, would the barometer measure Indigenous realities separately from settler realities? So the barometer has a lot of different questions that everybody answers. So no matter what your background is, you're answering the same questions. And we look at those values separately when we do an analysis so that we can compare and see kind of where the differences and where the similarities are between Indigenous and non-Indigenous participants. That analysis might get a little more nuanced as we get, years further into the project, but that's kind of where we're at right now. Thanks for your question, Trina. Now we have a question from Linda Young. So Linda asks, what happens when the survivors who can share their stories are no longer with us? Where will the energy to keep focusing on reconciliation come from? So that's a big, deep question. Feel free to, take a minute to think about it. We did go into kind of this whole idea that reconciliation is intergenerational a little bit earlier in our panel, but any thoughts on, what do we do when our survivors aren't with us anymore? How do we keep reconciliation going? Where does the energy come from?
I think I can provide a bit of an answer. It's more of an NCTR answer than a reconciliation barometer answer, and one of the other team members may have a more direct response. But I can say that the NCTR is continuing their work in developing and building capacity to continue to take survivor statements. And so while there were a large number of statements that were taken during the TRC, we know that many survivors did not come forward for a variety of reasons. And we've seen over the last 8 months an increase in interest of survivors to provide statements now. So, that is one of the actions that the NCTR is undertaking, and our archives team continues to work to expand our archives and the materials that we have, as well as approaches to how you even view records and what we have access to, and really doing work to shift the idea of archives and whose perspective can be given on a certain record, and really trying to even make sure that the records that we have, even if they're colonial documents, for there to be ways for Indigenous peoples and survivors to provide perspectives on this. And so that's, I think, some of the longer term goals and the mandate of the NCTR, at least as I understand it.
Very exciting. I did not know that statements were still being gathered. And I mean, I guess I should have known that, but that's really exciting. And to know that this really sought out archival work is still happening. Katherine, do you have any thoughts on this question?
I do. So for me, there are a lot of lasting effects of residential schools and a lot of other things that are both past and present, and so young people today have a lot to deal with. But my view is that there's also incredible strength in young people today. So I certainly see that in the lab. So the lab includes, 3 super talented, including Iloradanon, graduate students who, are always an inspiration. They're doing such great work. And I really see, that they'll be real change makers now and into the future. And so I do think that there is, this learning that is happening from generations, that people are talking about this, and that that people will continue to talk about this. Not everyone, though, but there will be, I think, enough people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous allies, who will continue to make this relevant. And if we don't, I think there will be real consequences. So it will come back to the top of people's minds, whether we do it intentionally or not, because these are things that you can't ignore. And so I would say that, I think there will be ongoing efforts by other generations for certain.
Yeah, so this idea that the youth can help carry and hold this into future generations over and over again, and if we're not working on it, it's going to come back. Rai, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I do, and thanks for the question, Linda. It's nice to see that come in. I can think back just along my own personal journey through this, and I think it's fair to state that right from the very, very beginning, even when we started the TRC, we always felt like, and I would say I continue to feel like, we're in a race against time for survivors. And so much of what drove our efforts through the TRC, and certainly my time at the NCTR, were to do whatever we possibly could and to work as hard as we possibly could to bring around the justice and the demonstrable change within the lifetimes of survivors, so that those survivors could then in turn have hope that, one, they would not be forgotten, and two, and more importantly, that they would be honored, that they would be remembered, and that what they went through would never happen again to any child anywhere. So I remain optimistic, and I have really I've been quite honestly so proud of the team at the NCTR and what they've accomplished in the last year, in regards to creating things that are just of such incredible lasting importance for this country too. Things like the survivors flag, things like the survivors flag that will continue. That it is essentially a new national flag that will continue to be seen across this country now for generations, reminding us of our responsibilities to family, to future generations, to Inuit, First Nations, and Métis peoples, to children. We do have this National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. I mean, that's a federal statutory holiday. I mean, it's a pretty big deal. If nothing else, it gives us the opportunity to remind Canadians that they have a responsibility to remember survivors and to keep survivors in their hearts. And I know for one, I mean, for as long as I've got breath in my body, I'm going to keep, doing this work. And there's a lot of other people out there like that too, and that gives me confidence. And I just hope that, more Canadians just understand the vital and critical importance of this work on a daily, hourly, minute by minute basis, really.
Yeah, thank you, Rai, for sharing that kind of message of hope, that we have these reminders that people who are so dedicated to this work right now are, making sure that this isn't going to go away, that we're going to keep talking about it, keep having these conversations. So we have, I think, we've got a couple more questions. We probably don't have time to get through all of them because we just have a few minutes left in the session. But one of them, submitted by Anonymous, is: would a barometer for reconciliation be applicable if indicators were adapted to specific government organizations to gauge their effectiveness? So I think Katherine is potentially well suited to answer this question, but I'm also, obviously, if any of the other panel members want to jump in, please feel free.
Rai, I know you've done a lot of thinking about this. Do you want to start? And I don't know,
Yeah, I think all I can say is that, I mean, the idea of having key performance indicators or holding yourself to account to determine whether or not you're succeeding or failing is not particularly groundbreaking in terms of thought. I mean, we do that all the time. Am I fitter? Am I smarter? Am I stronger? Am I hitting the ball further? Are we on track for our quarterly, whatever it is that we're doing? So, I mean, we adopt measurement in all sorts of different areas of our lives on a personal and on a professional level. And I think what the hope is with this tool is that it provides people with yet another measure to critically assess where we're at, and more importantly, where we're not at. And certainly I would be encouraging every single organization to be thinking very critically about what their goals are, what their actions are to achieve those goals, and then creating the correct and necessary measures within that organization to determine whether or not they're actually meeting the goals that they set out. I think, as with the barometer too, the goal has to be informed by Indigenous peoples and Indigenous rights. So there's no point making a goal if in the service of reconciliation, if you haven't got a good sense of, what you're reconciling with, or who you're reconciling for, or what you're even reconciling. So it's the lesson, I guess, is just, measure what matters and be careful what you're measuring to make sure that you're, putting that in the service of accomplishing goals that are actually more broadly in the service of human rights, equity, inclusion, healing, and strengthen societal relationships, and ultimately peacemaking, right? Ultimately peacemaking. That's what all of this is in the service of. So.
Thanks, Rai. So to add to that, what I would say is absolutely, like I think any organization could use the indicators that we have internally. But what that would require is a comparison of the internal to the national numbers. That would be, or the regional numbers. But in addition, I think that organizations that have the capacity should be measuring things more concretely that are related to these things. So for example, if you have data on personal equality across the country and you understand how Indigenous and non-Indigenous people think about that, you can compare how people within your organization think about things relative to these two groups. But then if you have the capacity to do this, certainly you could assess whether or not there are these differences within your own organization, within the province, within different sectors. So there are many ways to assess personal equality. There are lots of different facets that are really important to a good life. And there is good data out there already on this that could be combined to create like a national report. So what we have is data on perceptions of these things amongst people across the country. But there is also data on, what people actually make and how often they actually go see a doctor and what is the rate of heart disease in this group versus that group. And that data could be reported in a longitudinal way, and that could be most easily done through, of course, Statistics Canada reporting data centers and governments that have this data, but corporations also have this data. And so, I guess it requires some expertise, but that expertise is available. And certainly people are interested in collaborating. So there are lots of people interested in these questions across the country. And over the years, hopefully we can do something to bring together, not just reporting like we're going to be providing, but also this complementary reporting across sectors.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Katherine. Lots of potential for this project to, grow and grow and grow so that we can be learning all we can about this really important topic of reconciliation. Brenda, did you have anything you wanted to add here? It doesn't have to be a direct response to the question. You can kind of speak off of Rai or Katherine's points.
Well, I think, again, I have nothing to say about psychometrics, or at least nothing intelligent and informed. But I think coming back to what Rai was saying, and I think what Katherine is, it's really important that organizations figure out a way to start setting real goals on reconciliation and measuring their progress. And I think the barometer is one way, and it's up to the individual organization on whether or not the indicators of reconciliation that are identified in the barometer translate to their specific context and whether or not they're measuring the right things. Because it's not the measurement of reconciliation in every context for everyone all the time, right? And I don't think that's what we're claiming. So, but I think for me, more importantly, is within that question, I think the point is people need to start making sure that all aspects of society are moving towards reconciliation. And we can see part of that in the calls to action in the different areas, the legacy areas and different industries and sectors that really have significant impacts on Indigenous peoples and are directly connected to the history and legacy of residential schools. But I think more broadly, we want to make sure that people are taking the time to identify what actions they need to take and then reflect on whether they're working towards achieving them. And the psychometrics and the approach of the barometer is one way that we're choosing to measure the movement towards reconciliation in Canada.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Brenda. Yeah, highlighting that this is, one of many ways that this work is being done and that it really has the potential to motivate change and action. So we have come to the end of our session tonight. So thank you so much for tuning in today. This has been a really inspiring and insightful discussion on reconciliation in Canada. I know I've learned a ton from our panelists, and I hope all of our audience members have too. We've heard about the importance of systemic change, of long-term action that's grounded in the diverse realities of reconciliation, including the different realities that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people may experience in Canada. I want to thank the audience members for their stimulating questions and the organizers for all of their hard work putting this event together. Stay safe and stay healthy, and thanks for including us in your circle tonight. I hope you all have a good evening.